Okay, we're live. Hello, everyone. So this is Debunking Bad Criticisms of Utilitarianism, Matthew and Alistair. Lots of people say lots of things about utilitarianism that are nonsense, and so we thought that it would be useful to debunk it, kind of modeled on the bad apologetic streams that are done by James, Fodor, and Nathan from Digital Gnosis. The first video is from someone who's just sort of presenting the arguments for utilitarianism rather than taking a firm stance on them. So this person is not like very anti-utilitarianism, I don't think, but they do present some objections which are worth getting into. So let's share screen. Share screen. Okay.
So the last couple of classes, we've been talking about the theory of utilitarianism. And what I've tried to do is to explain the main principle to which the utilitarians adhere, which is the principle of utility. And this principle says that actions are right insofar as they produce aggregate happiness and wrong insofar as they produce aggregate pain. And what...
like lots of people are sort of imprecise when talking about utilitarianism, which is fine. But this is a bit of a misnomer. It's not like an action could produce both aggregate happiness and aggregate pain. Like if an action caused 5 extra units of happiness and 1 extra unit of pain, it would produce both. But utilitarianism just says that actions are right insofar as they bring about the most overall desirable mental states.
Best consequences impartially considered. So, yeah.
What I've tried to do is demonstrate that this theory is somewhat intuitive. I think we use it in many, many day-to-day kinds of decisions, very simple decisions sometimes, and even more serious decisions like what we've seen when we talk about how decisions are made when it comes to warfare. Sometimes we'll have to sacrifice a handful for the sake of the greater good. We've also seen how the utilitarians reason about a good number of more controversial issues, things such as the legalization of marijuana, or, for instance, we talked about what a utilitarian would say about capital punishment, our duties to, our ethical obligations to animals, or our ethical obligations to help those who are suffering in dire conditions in third world countries. And I think the theory of utilitarianism, it does seem plausible to a good many people, and it's actually been a very, very important and influential theory in the last 100 plus years. In some sense, even before that, even before it had a name, you'll see philosophers and you'll see people make decisions on the basis of whether or not that decision is going to lead to greater overall happiness or produce more overall pain. There's just something intuitive and right about this theory. Nonetheless, it does have some problems. And what we're going to do in this class is we're going to look at some of the bigger problems with utilitarianism. And what we're going to really be trying to do is push on the principle of utility and ask, what does this principle entail? What actions must it lead to and justify as morally right? I had said in the last class, or last couple classes, that the principle of utility, it doesn't square with every single moral belief that we happen to have. And that's okay to a certain extent. If it lines up with our shared core morality, as long as it lines up with that, then it might very well be an acceptable theory. We'll have to look at some other things to judge.
Well, I mean, so one point that I think is not made often enough is that utilitarianism is not just a theory of right action, and it's not primarily a theory of right action. It's a theory about what the aim of actions holistically should seek to be. So, like, if there was an evil demon that would torture everyone unless you became a deontologist, you should become a deontologist. Utilitarianism just says that the fundamental aim of our ethical actions should be to bring about the most well-being.
Total, but at least it has to line up with those shared core moral beliefs. If it pushes our beliefs that are on the periphery a little bit, the ones we're not so certain about collectively or individually, then the theory is not as problematic. But what we're going to see is that the principle of utility, when taken to its logical consequences, it doesn't seem to line up with our shared core morality. In fact, it seems like it's going to justify some things that appear to be very, very immoral to us. And so if...
Oh, no. Don't justify things. No.
If it does, if it justifies things that appear to us to be quite immoral, then that seems to be a big strike against the theory of utilitarianism. So before we get to these examples where the theory of utilitarianism really seems to press against our shared core morality, I want to remind you of an example we looked at before. And hopefully you remember this from a few classes ago. We talked about the Trolley Car Experiment. And in this experiment, just to remind you, basically what's going on is you have this...
Experiment? Oh, a thought experiment. Oh, I'm
that's a bit nitpick. But
trolley car and the brakes on it have been dismantled. And if you do absolutely nothing, this trolley car is going to bear down on this track and kill these 5 innocent people. If you throw the switch here, however, it'll divert the path of the trolley car down this path. It'll save these 5, but it'll end up killing just this one person. And many people feel that the appropriate thing to do in this situation is to throw the switch. Why? Because it would produce less pain and suffering in the world. That seems to be certainly what a utilitarian would say. You kill the 1, you save the 5. And so in this case, the theory of utilitarianism, it seems to line up with some intuitions that we oftentimes see people express or share. Now, not everybody always agrees with this thought experiment. I've encountered a number of people who would say they would do nothing and just allow the 5 to die. And, that might be, to some people that sounds preposterous and crazy, but it really isn't. And I can understand why somebody would say that. But what I've experienced is the vast majority of people, probably 80 to 90%, would say you throw the switch. And so here we see that utilitarianism does appear to align with what is our shared core moral beliefs. But I want you to put this in kind of the back of your mind for a second, and I want to share with you another thought experiment that's very, very similar to this one. So let's suppose that you go to the doctor's office just for a routine visit. You have to get your yearly checkup. And so you go to the doctor, and the doctor looks at you, and the doctor determines that you are in perfect health. The doctor says, you know what, you are a specimen of physical fitness. I've never seen anyone the likes of you. You are just perfect health. And you say,
what a weird doctor. The doctor say that?
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic, Doc. I'm glad to hear that. The doctor then tells you, well, I have some other patients I need to go check on really quickly. I'll be right back. And so the doctor steps out of the room you're in. And as you know, you've probably been to the doctor, and whenever the doctor steps out, it seems like they're gone for hours. It's like you don't know where they are, what they're doing. I think they're just messing with you, but that's my opinion. But so the doctor's gone for.
This person seems to have strange idiosyncratic views about doctors, but okay.
Well, you don't think much of it. You're just sitting there playing on your phone, figuring out what you're going to do for the rest of the day. And the doctor has 5 other patients, and she goes to look at them. And each one of these patients is on death's door, and each patient needs an organ in order to live. One patient needs a heart, one needs a liver, one needs a new kidney, another one needs a kidney, and we'll say one needs a new lung. And so the doctor is just stressed out about this. The doctor's distraught because 5 patients are about to die. There's no way that they can be saved. There are no organs nearby. They're all about to die. And then the doctor looks at your chart, and the doctor notices that just through some kind of medical miracle, you happen to be the world's universal organ donor. And that the doctor realizes that what she can do is that she can come in the room, and she could kill you, and she could harvest your organs and save these 5 people. She could just come in with a needle and say something to you like, hey, you need a booster shot for tetanus, and stick you in the arm with it, inject you, and then knock you out, kill you, take your organs, and save these 5 patients. Now, I want you to stop here and think about this for a second. And I want you to think, does this seem like something the doctor should do? I'm curious.
Well, so I think that it's something that the doctor should not do. Just like on practical grounds, killing people and harvesting their organs done by medical establishments does not make things go best. But if we modify the situation to make it so that, we know with absolute certainty no one will ever find out about it, it'll just save 5 rather than the 1. Well, I think that the doctor should. So, and I mean, this situation's been rigged by making it so that you're the guy who has to have their organs harvested. But if you were a random one of the 6 people in the hospital, you would hope that the doctor did that, given that otherwise 5 of the 6 people will die. And if they do this, 1 of the 6 people will die.
If you were like a third party, like benevolent observer, and you actually did have like this foreknowledge, like omniscience, and you knew for absolute certainty that like it would go impartially best, then I think it seems pretty intuitive that you would want.
Right. I mean, the only way to maintain that the doctor shouldn't do this, except on practical grounds, which we agree that they shouldn't do it on practical grounds, is to think that rights are what makes the difference. But so a few points about this situation that make our moral intuitions unreliable. So first is that sort of it references, so it like paints in vivid detail like you're the guy, and then it's like, but there are these extra deaths that are sort of amorphous and that are not discussed. And so and so obviously you're just like much more sympathetic to the person who is being killed and having their organs harvested. And we obviously, as a society, we have good reason to have a stronger reaction to a person being senselessly murdered than there just being preventable deaths, right? Because, murders are deterrable. They go to show much more callousness. They're less easily prevented, etc. And so it pits these sort of values against each other in a way that wouldn't be expected to be true. Second, the doctor has to show extraordinary recklessness. And so, it shows extraordinary recklessness on the part of the doctor. So it's like, okay, we stipulate that this doctor does this extraordinarily reckless thing that will almost always turn out to be bad, but we stipulate that in this rare case it ends up not being bad, or our intuitions are just not going to be super reliable there. It also just...
Yeah, I was going to say, like, most of these counterexamples are going to involve where everyday heuristics are going to come up against, like, insane examples where people have perfect foreknowledge of the consequences, and somehow they get really lucky with what they're able to predict. And I think that's very, like, it should give us at least some initial doubt as to whether our intuitions are going to be reliable in these cases.
Yeah, no, I agree. So this person in the chat says that when they walk into a hospital, they don't expect to have their organs removed. Right. That's part of the reason why a utilitarian wouldn't justify it, right? If you thought that your organs might be removed, that would not be good. So, and it also just throws in the word murder, which we generally have a very strong aversion to. And so the only way to maintain this is to think that rights are metaethically significant. But I have a bunch of objections to rights. I'll spell some of them out here. So the first one is that if rights are what matters fundamentally morally, well, that doesn't seem to be the case, because it seems like a world without rights would still possess moral significance. If every bad thing in the world happened not as a result of rights violations, but as a result of just like nature working its toll, it seems like there would still be bad things. And the only types of beings to whom we seem to assign rights are beings who can experience well-being and suffering. Now, you might say that, okay, rights are an emergent property of well-being. So once a being is able to experience well-being and suffering, then it gets rights. But that requires strong emergence. So that requires that there's just this new extra property that just appears when you have enough capacity for well-being and suffering that isn't baked in to the initial well-being and suffering. And yet we have prima facie reason to doubt that there is strong emergence, because there's like between 0 and 1 examples of strong emergence. Like strong emergence is very, very rare. And so if you have to invoke it to explain rights, that certainly counts against it.
I think my objection to, I don't know if you're going to bring this up, but my objection to rights would be that they seem somewhat arbitrary and ultimately justified via well-being. So I have the right to listen to music and like in private and do whatever I like. But if I listen to music at a certain level of like volume, then somehow that is going to turn into a rights violation. But that seems to just be directly, to me, that seems directly like relevant to like the well-being. So if magically playing music loud did not cause people to suffer, like if you just imagine that world, then we wouldn't say that's a rights violation. So it seems like that it's connected to well-being ultimately, in my view.
Yeah, I agree. Justice says they have a problem with the doc killing them. Well, okay, one, I think egoism is a terrible view. But if we accept egoism, then we should think that it would be that in general, like if for a random one of the people in the hospital, then we should hope that they do it, because the odds that we're saved to killed as a result of the doctor's actions are 5-1. Twisted asks if we can define arbitrary. Well, without a deeper foundation. So like arbitrary is a bit tricky to define, but
I'd say without a principled reason, I guess, and especially with rights, how they just coincidentally happen to coincide with well-being. Like that'd be like more expected given utilitarianism, at least from my perspective.
Right. A third objection that I would have to rights is that, and I'm going to go over a bunch of objections here just so we can sort of reference them later in the video and people bring up rights. So if we think that rights are ethically significant, then there's a number of rights violations that could outweigh any amount of suffering. And so if we can choose between two states of the world, state of the world 1, we all constantly violate each other's rights. But like we all violate each other's rights a billion times a second, but we all are living in just this state of hedonic bliss where our lives, we just experience just unfathomable well-being. And in State of the World 2, we all, every single moment of our existence is just horrific agony, like as worse than the worst form of torture imaginable. And so in that case, a deontologist would seem to have to hold that State of the World 2 would be better. And yet it seems like State of the World 2 would obviously be worse. And so, we care about rights in small quantities, but when you have a lot of rights violations and you compare them to a lot of well-being, it just becomes obvious that a lot of well-being is better. Similarly, if there was an alien civilization for which the only way it could avoid horrific agony was to just grab the leg of humans every second, then that would be a good thing to do. If that would make it to just grab the leg of every human every second to go from a state of horrific torture to tons of well-being, I think it.
If somehow looking at somebody would shoot out laser eyes and completely torture them, then it would be wrong. We would think you have a right not to be looked at, or something like that. It's a funny example I use.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that an account that says that rights are just heuristics for maximizing well-being is not, it's not particularly counterintuitive, and I don't think that it really goes very much against our understanding of rights. I think that a good analogy is the principle of being innocent until proven guilty. Like, a person is not actually innocent until proven guilty, but it's a useful legal heuristic. The world is better when we act as if people are innocent until proven guilty. And so I think that rights can be similar without it robbing our understanding. Another objection.
I mean, should we clarify here that it's not like we're saying politically there shouldn't be any rights. Okay.
Right.
Like we're saying they're useful fictions, and that's the reason why they should be enforced, basically. And
right, yeah.
It's good for, at least for common sense. They work most of the time, but not in every situation.
Yeah, that's true. Like we're all in favor of the Constitution, for example, guaranteeing people human rights. The same way that we think innocence until proven guilty it's a good thing that that's part of the law, even though a person is not literally innocent until proven guilty. Let's see. Should I? Here, I have more objections to rights, but I'll have this be the last one for now. So, one more objection to rights is that the notion of rights, so the notion of rights, generally we think that it's more important to avoid violating people's rights than it is to prevent other rights violations. But this gets us into problems. So suppose that we're at a park and we laid down a landmine that would blow up one person. But so then we become moral, and then we want to undo the landmine. But while we were doing that, we see two other landmines that will blow up 4 people, let's say. And so we can either unblow up the landmine that we set down or prevent the 2 landmines from being detonated. Well, if we unblow up our own landmine, then we wouldn't have violated anyone's rights. No extra person would have been harmed as a result of our actions. And yet it seems very unintuitive to say that we should prevent other people's landmines or prevent our own landmines over other people just because we laid them down. Similarly, hey, Trolley Dave, it would seem unintuitive to say, for example, that let's imagine that a person created a disease in a laboratory. It seems like if that happened, it wouldn't become more important for them to reduce the prevalence of that disease relative to other diseases. But if it is based on rights violations, then it seems it would. There are more objections, but we can get to them later.
How many of you would agree with this? Do you think the doctor should kill you to take your organs and save 5 people? My experience has been everybody thinks this is wrong. I've never met a single person, or maybe one out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, who says the doctor should kill you and take your organs.
He's now met 3.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, we don't think that you should do it on practical grounds.
Even if we're not
unless we add in a bunch of extra stipulations.
I'm talking about you. If it's just some random Joe Schmo you've never heard of, no one ever says, yeah, the doctor should kill you and take your organs. There seems something very immoral about this. And this raises a good question, because we have to ask, well, what would the utilitarian say about it? And at least at a first pass, it seems like what the utilitarian would say is, if it produces more happiness overall, then the doctor should kill you. It seems like what...
Well, yeah, that's true of literally all things. Like, you know, I mean, you could say that about anything, including things that utilitarianism obviously doesn't justify. So you could say, like, well, how would the utilitarianism respond to whether or not you should hit people in the head with hammers? Well, the utilitarian would say that if it produces more happiness overall, then it's good. Well, of course, it just doesn't, which is why it's bad. Like, if your objection to a moral theory is, if on this moral theory it said X would be good, then it would say that X was good, but X is bad, that's not an objection. Like, you have to actually give a case where it seems like our intuitions are wrong, rather than just like stipulating a case where it seems like our intuitions are right, and then just like throwing in the stipulation that it like is not good on the moral theory.
What the utilitarian would say would be exactly what the utilitarian would say in this situation. You kill one, you save 5. And now you might say, and I oftentimes hear people say, let me back up here again. They say, yeah, but sorry, let me move forward here. What I oftentimes hear people say is that, yeah, but the 5 patients who are each about to die, you know, they're going to die anyway. They're going to die, and they're on death's door, so to speak. And the thing to say in response to that is, but the same thing was true of the 5 who were on the train tracks. The trolley car was...
Yeah, I mean, that's a terrible objection from...
Yeah.
barreling down on them. And if you did nothing, if you just stood by passively, they were going to die. And it's the exact same scenario going on here. If you do nothing, these 5 patients are going to die. Your alternative is you kill one other person, and that is you throw the switch, right? Or you shoot them with a needle in the arm and knock them out. You throw the switch and you kill one and you save 5. And, you know, this is kind of I know this is kind of a contrived scenario here, and some of you might be thinking this could never happen, and fair enough, it really couldn't, but you can hopefully see what the principle of utility would lead someone to do, or lead someone to believe. For a utilitarian, at least at a first pass, like I'm saying, at least initially, what it seems like their view is committed to is that if you were in a situation like this, which probably would never arise, but if you were, you should kill one person, take their organs, and then save 5 other people.
I kind of feel this is very, like, it's the same. I have the same reaction to, like, torture and, like, just horrific things, that if you specify in, like, this weird, like, example, it would just increase utility somehow, maximize utility, then you should do it. Then it's like, okay, so you're asking us to imagine a world, like, so different from ours anyway in the first place, that if our intuitions were, like, tuned to that world anyway, we might not even have that reaction against it. So, like, it's hard to see how reliable our intuitions would be when we're taking them into these weird hypothetical scenarios that, like, never happen in real life.
Yeah.
So.
Twisted says that they seem to entail crazy stuff, but there's 2,000 premise syllogism to counter. Well, we've just given, like, 6 different, very simple arguments to counter it. And, you know, there are a lot more. There are more where that came from. Hey, Philip Mueller, what's up?
Lead to overall happiness. It's very, very similar to the trolley car thought experiment. Like I said, some of you might be rolling your eyes, and some of you might be thinking, oh my gosh, here these philosophers go again with these silly thought experiments. But I want to give you a kind of real-world example of something very much like this. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of what are called the Tuskegee Syphilis experiments, but these were a set of clinical experiments that were performed over a very long period of time, about a 40-year period of time in Tuskegee, Alabama, from 1932 to 1972.
Yeah, the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment is obviously not justified by utilitarianism. Like, it inflicted vast amounts of suffering, undercut trust in the medical establishment in the future. I mean, like, I think that if anything, is a paradigmatic example of why utilitarians generally would not support the doctor harvesting organs. But I mean, there's just it was not the case that the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment did maximize well-being.
Yeah, but if it's stipulated to maximize well-being, then that's what he's going to do, though, isn't he?
Well,
he's going to say
what was going on in these experiments is doctors were testing the long-term effects of syphilis on African Americans, and what they did is they weren't even honest with the people who were in this experiment as to why they were being tested. They told the participants that they were being tested for bad blood, but basically what they were doing is they were watching people slowly die from syphilis. So people would come in, the doctors would study them and say, okay, this is what's going on. We're giving you treatments, but the treatments were all just made up. They weren't really treating the patients. They told the patients they were being treated, but they were just watching them die. And the reason they did this is basically they offered a straightforward utilitarian rationale. They said that what they wanted to do was study these people so they could learn how you could manage pain for people who were suffering from syphilis.
Well, no, I mean, I think that their rationale involved not caring about the interests of Black people very much. Like, I think that a somber utilitarian analysis that cared equally about everyone's interests would have concluded that that was obviously not justified.
Syphilis, that way, in the long run, they could maybe help more people. So their expressed intentions in doing this experiment was basically utilitarian. It's like, hey, we're going to subject these handful of people to a medical experiment.
Yeah, people will often say this, that their intents are utilitarian. Well, one, utilitarianism doesn't care about your intent. Two, like, they never are, right? Like, people will just assert that the intents are utilitarian. Like, when people say it, I'll often just ask people to produce a quote of anyone saying, like, that it was utilitarian, and they never can.
I mean, I've had some crazy examples. Like, have you had the Nazis were utilitarian before?
Yeah,
like I've had that before.
No, I mean, it's insane. Like, if we actually look at any historical atrocity, the common trends are generally twofold. One, the utilitarians always seem to be against it. Jeremy Bentham was in favor of legalizing homosexuality in 1798. John Stuart Mill was the second member of parliament to advocate giving women the right to vote. Sidgwick was also very progressive, advocating for giving women extra rights, educational reform, etc. So, one, utilitarians are nearly always against these atrocities. But two, all of the atrocities came from excluding a subset of sentient beings from our moral circle. No, Twisted. Alistair is the guy with whom I'm critiquing the video. Alistair didn't make this video. And so, like, all of the atrocities, if we actually look at them, they came from not being utilitarian, from excluding some subset of sentient beings from our moral circle, which is explicitly not allowed by utilitarians.
Without their full knowledge of what's going on, we're going to manipulate these people. In some cases, they even lied to them and obstructed their efforts to seek medical treatments elsewhere because the people realized, like, hey, we know that this treatment isn't working. We want to go somewhere else. And the doctors told them that they couldn't. The doctors lied to them in these kinds of experiments. And so basically the doctors were watching these people slowly die so they could gain information which they thought would prove useful in the long run. And this experiment is even more messed up than what I've just explained to you, because along the way of testing or subjecting these people to this experiment, doctors actually discovered a cure for syphilis. The cure is just penicillin. Antibiotics cures it. But the doctors didn't administer it to these patients because they thought that this information they were going to get would be so valuable in the long run. And in fact, a number of doctors, the way they viewed it is that this was probably the last batch of people who were going to have syphilis. So it was all the more important to study the long-term effects so they could have important scientific knowledge moving forward. It's again, this is something very similar to the previous example of going to the doctor's office, like I was saying. Primarily.
Yeah, I mean, but giving, like, then...
Yeah, can I just say, it's quite ironic in a way, because if you just take, like, animal testing nowadays, like, utilitarians are generally against it when it comes to, like, ridiculous stuff like cosmetics or, like, you know, a bunch of the stuff that animal testing has done is for completely, like, frivolous reasons, right? And even though we'd say it could be justified in certain circumstances, like the vast majority of animal testing is just completely not okay. So, and I'd be very surprised if you'd actually look at the knowledge that, like, these people had access to, that these experiments would have been justified. Like, I highly doubt that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, so people will try to give, like, thought experiments to argue that utilitarianism has absurd results. But, well, where they'll say, like, here's this really horrible thing, and utilitarianism would say that it's good. But no, like, if all of the reasons that they give for why it's horrible and had terrible results and brought about the deaths of tons of people and caused vast amounts of misery, all of those are true, and so utilitarianism doesn't justify it. Like, in order to think utilitarianism justifies a bad thing, you have to think that that bad thing was overall conducive to well-being. But I don't think that the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was conducive to well-being.
primarily because what we see here is we see doctors experimenting on people, subjecting them to an experiment without their full knowledge and full disclosure. Why? For the greater good, because they thought it would produce more happiness in the end. And this is something that it seems like, again, at least at a first pass, the utilitarian will say, well, if it produced more good.
Yes, utilitarianism does sanction anything if the person says it's for the greater good at the end of it. So, like, you know, if you like just torture people, but you say like it was for the greater good, then utilitarianism does justify it. That's why utilitarianism justifies every like supervillain ever. You know.
Then why not subject people to medical experiments? What if it produced more good overall to round up homeless people off the street and sever their spine so you can perform spinal surgery on them? What if that led to more overall happiness in the end? It seems like a utilitarian would say, go for it. You should do it. If it leads to more happiness.
Well, right. So so if we want to think through a situation where that would lead to more overall happiness, we have to stipulate so many extra things. And then when we think vividly about that situation, it becomes less intuitive. It's like, okay, let's imagine that was the only way to like do medical tests to prevent the end of the world. Well, okay, in that case, then it does seem intuitive. Like if that's the only way to prevent the end of the world, then it seems fine. That was the only way to prevent like millions of people from dying, that would be fine. Because remember, this would require like annihilating the concept of human rights, making people terrified of walking around on the streets because they're worried about being rounded up and having their spines taken. It would cause like the mass amounts of suffering and death for homeless people. And so it would just be a massive cost. And so it's only if we stipulate very implausible things that it can be justified, but then the scenario stops looking so unintuitive. If we knew with total certainty that it was the only way to prevent every human from dying, then that doesn't seem intuitive.
Happiness in the end, then anything in principle could be justifiable. But this doesn't seem right. An ethical theory which tells you could experiment on people against their wills seems immoral. Now, there's nothing wrong with experimenting on people if you let them know up front and they agree to it. There's nothing wrong with it. I had friends who actually would go and earn an income by subjecting themselves to medical experiments. They go to these trials, and I think one of them, he tested inhalers for a week and he got paid like $2,000. But he signed off on a waiver form and he understood what the purpose of it was and he agreed to it and he wanted his money. But if you're forcing people into a medical experiment, that's an entirely different matter. And I think many people would find that.
Well, right, but utilitarianism will basically always say that you should give people the option, right? Like, if we think that the medical advances are so useful that they outweigh the risks to people, then utilitarianism would say that you should be willing to pay them. And so you might say like, okay, well, what about in cases where the experiment has to like bring about the death of someone? So where the only way to discover a cure for some disease that would otherwise kill all humans would be to do experiments that involve killing people. And so we can't pay them because we have to kill them. Well, the way around this is just to pay people to enter into a lottery in which they would have a small chance of being chosen. So you pay them $100,000 to have a 1 or a 0.1% chance of that. Wait, Philip Mueller, I'm not sure if you're joking, but yeah, T-Jump's metaethics is just so bad. Okay. Yeah, T-Jump is... I have a very low opinion of T-Jump.
It's something that's just immoral, something you don't do. Utilitarianism seems to imply that you can, and in fact, you're morally required to do it. So this seems to be a case where the theory of utilitarianism cuts against our deeply held moral beliefs.
Well, I don't know that our deeply held moral beliefs are that there are some things that are so terrible that you should never do them. Like, it seems like in most cases...
if you could kill someone to prevent a nuclear war, like, doesn't seem impermissible to me to do that.
Right.
But
like, for any action, it seems like if any action would prevent infinite people from being infinitely tortured, it seems good. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me give you a few more examples of this. So we had talked about criminal punishment before, and remember when we talked about criminal punishment, we said that for a utilitarian, the only thing that matters for them is that the punishment maximizes overall happiness. If when you punish someone, if it produces a greater social benefit, then that's the reason to do it. If it doesn't, then you shouldn't punish someone. Now, for the utilitarian, they're not concerned about what a person deserves. They're only concerned about, will this punishment produce more happiness in the end? Now, here's the thing about that. That sounds all well and good. And a lot of people have said that this is the only sound policy that we should adopt as a country that punishes people. A lot of people have argued, utilitarians and even some non-utilitarians have said that this idea of punishing people because of what they deserve is just this, barbaric bloodthirst for revenge. The only reason we should punish people is if it produces greater social good, which is basically another way of saying if it maximizes happiness. But there's some problems with this. And I want to highlight these problems by asking you this. Well, what if it maximized happiness? What if it produced a greater social good to have excessively harsh punishments for crimes? For instance, what if you were caught speeding, going 5 miles over the speed limit, and you got thrown in prison for a year for it? Well, let's say you got thrown in prison for 10 years for it. Now, it might produce some greater social good. Maybe nobody would ever speed again if that were the case. Or what if you got caught?
No, it wouldn't produce greater social good. What?
Yeah.
No, it would. No, like people are not fully rational actors, and so they wouldn't stop speeding. But like what I don't understand. So like, I mean, if the argument is that society would be like better off if we had harsh punishment, but then harsh punishment is still bad, that's very unintuitive. Right? Like, if anything, it seems like the opposite's true, that utilitarians tend to be more lax on the criminal justice system because they don't think that people deserve to suffer. They just think that that punishment should be done only insofar as it brings about the best outcomes.
I mean, you could just like stipulate in the example that.
Well, sure. I mean, so if you stipulate that going 5 miles over the speed limit, that throwing everyone in jail, like it's hard to think of a world. So if everyone responded fully rationally to incentives, such that made it just so that no one ever sped and no one ever got thrown in jail, that doesn't seem so bad. Assuming that if they sped, it would result in lots of extra deaths. That doesn't seem bad at all.
Caught jaywalking and you had your leg cut off for it. I bet there'd be a lot fewer people jaywalking. Or what if you got caught stealing and you got your hands cut off? Or what if you got caught lying and you had your tongue cut off? Or what if you got caught looking at pornography or child pornography and you had your eyes gouged out? I bet this would maximize some social benefits. I bet there'd be a lot fewer people breaking.
Like, he can't even say that it would maximize social benefits because it obviously wouldn't. So he says it maximizes some social benefits. Well, okay, but if we can consider the full picture, you know, if a person for like looking at pornography had their eyes gouged out and had their tongue cut off for lying, well, nearly everyone lies. Like essentially all humans lie, right? And so basically no one would have tongues. But like, okay, let's try to think of a situation in which this would actually maximize well-being, because it would have to be a very different situation for this world. Like, imagine that this policy would make it so that no one ever lies, and every time a person lies, every time a lie is told, imagine it were the case that just like a child would get brutally tortured to death. Well, then it would seem intuitive. So like in all the cases, if you're just like, well, if we just stipulate that it's good, then utilitarianism says it's good. But if we actually think about what's required before we stipulate that it's good, then it starts to seem unintuitive at all.
Yeah.
These crimes. What if you got caught, again, I don't know, cheating or something like that, and you got beaten? Or what if you got caught graffitiing and you got beaten? I bet there'd be a lot fewer people doing this. In fact, there was a case when I was in high school of some American students who went to, I want to say it was Singapore, and they graffitied some cars there. It was really dumb. I don't know why you go to another country and do something like that. And the punishment was they got beaten with the cane pole. That was the punishment. And they got beaten. Our State Department couldn't get them out of the situation. That's why people in some...
Do you think that society would be better off if people got beaten brutally for like jaywalking? Also, people who are watching, you should like the video, just FYI.
Countries, they don't steal. That's why people in some countries, they don't, graffiti or commit crimes, because the punishments are so harsh. What if the only punishment ever for a crime was death? Do you think people would break the law? Probably not. And so here we see...
Yes.
Yes, they would. I mean, there's a reason why the death penalty doesn't work as a deterrent, even for the most serious crimes anyway. So
yeah, I mean, more than about like 20 years, it doesn't seem to provide any extra deterrence based on empirical data. So like, but I mean, look, people act stupidly. And I mean, I think that a world in which everyone's terrified of ever like lying or breaking the law, because if they do so, they will be murdered, is not a world that has the most well-being, obviously.
See that the theory of utilitarianism, in a way, or in a very obvious way, it cuts against something that a lot of us believe, which is that the punishment should fit the crime. You shouldn't spend 5 years in prison for speeding. This is why a lot of people...
What does it mean for the punishment to fit the crime? So like, let's imagine that a person does drunk driving. Well, and doesn't kill anyone, but they just get pulled over. Like, no one gets harmed as a result of their drunk driving. Well, should that not be illegal because there was no harm? What about attempted murder? Well, attempted murder doesn't harm anyone. It's only actual murder. So should attempted murder have no punishment associated with it? If a person is a little bit negligent and it results in like a like terrible outcome that kills like 50 people, should they like be like brutally tortured and killed so that the punishment fits the crime? No, I mean, it's just a slogan. It's not anything that anyone actually believes.
Yeah.
Okay.
have problems with laws against marijuana because people will spend 10 years in prison for simple possession, or they'll spend 5 years in prison for simple possession. And
yeah, that's why the marijuana laws are not good for overall well-being, which is why utilitarians often are opposed to are in favor of prison reform. Right? Yeah, Twisted points out, like, Bentham was a big advocate for prison reform. Effective altruists, who are sort of the like a organization that's largely acting on utilitarian principles, one of the things that they push for is prison reform.
a lot of people feel like that's just, the punishment is disproportionate.
Like, if we look at in any political dispute about criminal justice, what side the utilitarians are on, generally the utilitarians are on the more lenient side, because the utilitarians rightfully say that, like, we should, the people still have interests even if they did something bad.
Proportionate to the crime. This is why people have problems with 3 strikes and you're outlaws, because you could commit 3 minor crimes, like stealing $10 on 3 separate occasions, and then spend 20 years in prison. And that makes no sense. Why, again, should you spend 20 years in prison for stealing a total of $30? Why should it matter that you did it on 3 separate occasions versus just 1? It makes no sense. So this is why a lot of people have problems with these kinds of laws, because the punishment is not proportional to the crime. But utilitarianism doesn't care about proportionality between crime and punishment. All they care about is, will the punishment lead to more social benefit? And
well, okay, so this is misleading. They say that utilitarianism doesn't care about it being proportional. No, I mean, not really. Utilitarianism doesn't care intrinsically about it being proportional, but it certainly cares instrumentally about it being proportional. I mean, the same way that utilitarianism doesn't care intrinsically about, like, people not sawing each other's legs off, but it cares instrumentally, because when people do saw each other's legs off, that's not conducive to utility.
I think people don't take the, like, punishment fits the crime thing. I don't think they take it to its logical conclusion. So I can't see any principled reason why, like, you'd say, okay, a murderer has to be imprisoned for like 30 years or something like that. Okay, then someone who committed, let's say, like 20 murders, it seems like the only way for that to be proportional would be to either, like, torture them or do something just horrifically bad because it's what they deserve, because their crime is literally 20 times worse than, like, one murder. I mean,
yeah, would we want what we do with Hitler to be to just find the most agonizing way possible to kill him, to, like, just slowly torture him in, like, just the worst ways we can conceive of? No, probably not.
And if it does, make the punishment as severe as possible. If it leads to greater social benefit, it's irrelevant how harsh it is, as long as it makes more happiness in the world. Or what if it maximizes...
Making it harsh detracts from how much happiness is.
Happiness. What if it produced social benefit to punish innocent people? What if just rounding up innocent people off the streets, punishing them to set an example, led to greater social good? Or what if there was someone who was convicted of a crime? Suppose there'd been a serial killer on the loose, and somebody was caught for it. Or suppose there'd been someone who was a killer, and somebody was caught for it, but the sheriff or the judge knew the person who was caught was actually innocent. But the people were demanding that somebody be punished for these crimes. And so what if the judge said, thinking to himself, well, I know this guy's innocent, but I need to give somebody to the people to silence the mob who's going to riot if we don't punish someone. So that the judge just hands the person over to the mob and they kill him, or the judge just goes ahead and sentences the guy to death just to silence the mob. What if punishing innocent people, and there could be cases where this could arise, led to greater overall happiness? Or what if, and this is actually kind of the case in the United States, we just had a justice system where we just threw the book at pretty much everybody who walked through the doors of the courthouse, and the reason we did that was due to the fact that we were trying to catch all the bad guys, but by focusing so much on catching the bad guys, we actually punish a lot of innocent people in the process. In fact, this has happened with the death penalty in some cases. There was a classroom a journalism class at Northwestern in Chicago, Illinois, and probably this was about 15 years ago. As a class project, they started to investigate people who were on death row in the state of Illinois, and they found that about 10 to 15 people on death row were actually innocent of the crimes they were charged with. Some of them hadn't even been present at the scene of the crime. And so you had just this classroom of 20, 21-year-old students basically figuring out these people were innocent by doing simple things like cross-checking witnesses.
Utilitarians are generally opposed to the death penalty. Punishing innocent people is a major cost, and utilitarians are against it. But so if the case is like the one you gave before, where, like, if you don't frame an innocent person, then the mob will kill a bunch of people. Well, so, instrumentally, you shouldn't do it for the reasons given before. Like, framing innocent people sets a really bad precedent. It's very harmful. But if we stipulate that, no one will find out, it'll bring about the most utility. Well, I read a blog post actually arguing that you should, and I can, here I can link to the, Okay, let's see. How do I wait? Is there a way to whatever? Okay.
Various other things that should have been done.
Yeah. Okay, wait. Yeah, here's the link. Okay. Yeah, so that was my blog post. Okay. So okay, so you know, a couple of reasons we shouldn't trust that intuition. First, in most realistic situations, we shouldn't frame innocent people. So we have a strong reason to have that be a strong heuristic. Second, we have a good reason to just be disgusted by the idea of framing innocent people. So we can sort of give a sociological debunking account of it. Third, we can give an account where we imagine that there were 6 people and they were all your family members, and you could have the mob kill 5 of your family members, or have one of your family members be framed. Well, I think that most of us would think that it would be better for one of your family members to be framed rather than for the mob to kill 5 of your family members. And so if we have sympathy for everyone involved, then it seems like we don't have that intuition anymore.
That's a good counter, because utilitarianism really does have radical impartiality. So really, you should instrumentally, you probably shouldn't value non-family members greater than as the same as your parents and that. But in terms of what the theory actually says, their well-being is no more important than any other person's well-being. So that's a good response.
And so another objection is, okay, let's imagine that we have a case where we can either prevent one innocent person from being framed, or prevent 5 innocent people from being killed by a lynch mob. Well, in that case, it just seems obvious that we should prevent the 5 innocent people from being killed by a lynch mob. And so if we could prevent one of them, it's much more important to prevent the 5 deaths. So now, you might appeal to an active mission distinction where you say, okay, well, it's true that 5 people getting killed by a lynch mob is worse than 1 person being framed. You shouldn't do a bad thing to prevent a even more bad thing. But we can modify the case such that we can come up with a modification to the case to get around this. So suppose that you mail a letter to a lynch mob into a sheriff department, where you say, this guy did it, okay? And so if they open the letter, they'll conclude that the guy did it, and then they'll frame and they'll kill that innocent person. However, there's also a letter that says for a different crime that 5 other people did it. And so if you mail the first letter in, so if the first letter gets mailed in and read, then then that 1 person will get framed. And if the second letter gets read by the mob will kill 5 people. And so you send the letter that will frame the innocent people, okay? And then you have heart, and you're like, why am I framing an innocent person? So you run to the mailbox, but you can only take out 1 letter. So you can only either take out the one that will instruct the mob to kill the 5 people, or that will frame the 1 innocent person. Well, it seems obvious that you should take out the one that will have the mob frame the 5 people. But if it's more important to not violate, but so if you take that action, then where you take out the letter that tells the mob to kill the 5 people, well, then the sum total of your action is you result in 1 extra person being framed to prevent a mob from killing 5 people, rather than just allowing a mob to kill 5 people rather than taking an action. And so in that case, that just seems like a clear counterexample. In both cases, you're framing an innocent person to save 5. We can also imagine another parallel case in which a mob is planning on killing lots of people because they think that they all conspire to do a crime. They think that conspiring to do the crime is especially horrendous. So if they believe that only 1 person committed the crime, they would beat that person severely but not kill that person. However, the person would otherwise be killed by the mob along with everyone else. Well, in that case, it seems obvious that you should frame that person, given that everyone will be better off. They'll be better off because they'll be beaten rather than just killed, and everyone else will be better off because they won't be killed. So that seems like a very clear counterexample. We can give some more of the objections to rights, because I think that there are some more problems with rights that might be worth.
Let's see where this goes after this.
Okay. Oh wait, sorry. Should we give the objections to rights first, or should we play a little more of it?
But play it a little longer.
Now, some people would say, in defense of criminal punishment, say, well, look, it's so important to set an example and to punish people. If a few innocent people get killed in the process, well, it's just a numbers game, basically. To me, that seems really harsh and horrible and immoral.
Look, okay, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs.
One of the things that seems absolutely worse to me is that an innocent person should be punished for something that they didn't do, especially executed. But for a utilitarian...
Well, but if the alternative is 5 innocent people being murdered, that seems worse.
What if it does lead to more overall social benefit to kill innocent people? They would say, go ahead and do it, as long as it leads to greater social benefit. And so here we see some ways in which the theory of utilitarianism is really at odds with our ordinary ways of thinking.
Well, he says leads to, it's using sort of hand-wavy language of greater overall social benefit. But the greater overall social benefit is rather than one person being framed, a bunch of people not being killed, or a bunch of other people not being framed, people not be victim to horrendous crimes, etc. So
it can justify some really, really horrible things. And so what the theory of utilitarianism seems to do, and seems to have a major problem with, is making sense of what we call basic human rights. Now, we talk about rights. What we're talking about are...
What basic human rights?
Claims or entitlements. And there are various kinds of rights that people have. Some rights we have, these are known as legal rights, like the right to bear arms. Well, the reason you have that right is because a bunch of people got together a couple hundred years ago, they created the U.S. Constitution, and they said, we're going to give you this right. But that's the kind of right that could be taken away from you if Congress were to make an amendment to the Constitution. But there are other kinds of rights that we have that we refer to as natural rights. And these kinds of rights are described as being inalienable, meaning they can't be taken away from you. Now, people can violate these kinds of rights, but that just shows that what they've done is wrong. These kinds of rights can't be taken away from you simply as a product of people voting to remove them. These are the kinds of rights, these natural rights, human rights, are the kinds of rights you have just in virtue of being a person. You have these kinds of rights. And our Constitution...
Why do we have those rights in virtue of being a person? I don't understand the idea of natural rights. What about us makes it so that we have these natural rights? And it's a strange coincidence that all of the natural rights seem to be contingent on whether or not they generally lead to the most utility in society. So as you said earlier, we think that you have a natural right to speak in public. But if whenever you spoke, it would just rupture everyone's eardrums, then you wouldn't have that natural right. And so there's no way to make sense of any of these rights except in terms of looking at utility. Why is it a rights violation to look at someone's house, to enter someone's house, but not to look at someone's house? Well, in both cases, you're doing something that affects their house. And so I don't know. Yeah, I don't think that the notion...
They just seem to be contingent on a bunch of different factors, and it's not entirely clear how, as you said, my example earlier of if somehow looking at people would instantly vaporize them and make them suffer, then people would have a right not to be looked at. What we would think that people would have the right not to be looked at, but I think that's ultimately grounded in well-being.
Yeah. So in terms of some more objections to rights. So one is that I think that we have good evolutionary debunking accounts of rights. So an evolutionary debunking account is an argument that says that our beliefs and rights are the result of some unreliable cognitive process. So just the result of sort of unreliable emotional reactions. And it seems like there's very good evidence for that. So Green et al. In 2010 say, quote, a substantial body of evidence indicates that utilitarian judgments favoring the greater good made in response to difficult moral dilemmas are preferentially supported by controlled reflective processes, whereas deontological judgments favoring rights/duties in such cases are preferentially supported by automatic intuitive processes. People with damaged ventromedial prefrontal cortexes, which are a part of the brain that's responsible for generating emotions, when those are damaged, they become much more utilitarian. And a 2021 study by Fornacier et al. Concluded that people with greater reasoning ability was correlated with being more utilitarian, and it assembled the largest data set. So really, when people are not utilitarian, when they believe in rights, it's just because,
you probably should mention there is a slight correlation between psychopathy and utilitarian judgments as well.
Yeah, utilitarians are...
Yeah.
I mean, Yeah, utilitarians are disproportionately likely to be reasoning well and also disproportionately likely to be psychopaths. So, there are two ways of getting you to utilitarianism, but yeah. So, and an eighth another objection to rights is that, so they run into a problem based on the aims of a third-party benevolent observer. So we generally think that a third-party benevolent observer, so like if you just have this are looking at things from a bird's eye view, you should hope for the best state of affairs. That seems almost true by definition. And yet it also seems true, and so that means that they should hope, so a consequentialist acts in ways that bring about the best state of affairs. So a third-party benevolent observer, if a person's looking at things from bird's eye view impartially, they should hope that you are a consequentialist. Well, it also seems like what a third-party benevolent impartial observer would hope you should do is what you should actually do, right? If a perfectly moral third party thinks that you should do something where they have full information and they're perfectly benevolent, you probably should do it. And so, to the extent that a third-party observer would rather one person die rather than five, then they should hope that you kill one to save five.
You'd end up in this situation where, like an observer with like omniscience and perfect knowledge would rather you act wrongly than do the right thing, if they're just looking at, the overall state of affairs, which seems like a very weird implication of like deontology, in my view.
Right. Yeah. So two more arguments. So one of them is a spin-off of an argument made by Yetter Chapel. Yetter Chapel's argument is much more clever and also much more complicated, so I'm not going to hash it out in full. But so the basic argument is, this is an argument for why you should kill one person to prevent 5 murders. So the argument is, so a benevolent third-party observer should either, if they're deciding between which is worse, killing in an attempt to save 5 or just killing indiscriminately, it is obviously the case that killing in an attempt to save 5 is not morally worse than killing indiscriminately. Maybe they're morally equal. Maybe killing indiscriminately is better, but at least it's not worse to kill one to try to save 5 than it is to kill one indiscriminately. And so killing one to save 5 is, in terms of badness, is less than or equal to just killing one indiscriminately. Well, and killing one indiscriminately from the standpoint of a third-party observer is obviously less bad than 5 people killing one indiscriminately. And so a third-party benevolent observer should rather you kill one to save 5 than 5 people be murdered. And so then that's one other objection to rights. And Yetter Chapel argues this in an article that I believe is called "The Cost of Constraints." One more objection to rights. This one's slightly complicated, but I think you're all smart enough to follow it. No perfectly rational observer, like a third party who knows everything and is perfect.
As if they're like an ideal observer, so they have perfect knowledge of the situation and expected consequences.
Right. So the last objection, there might be more objections coming later. We'll see. So the objection is, so suppose that you're making a decision. So a deontologist would hold, or a person who believes in rights, that you should not kill one person to save 5. However, so let's imagine that you have people that are in a series of circles. Okay. So there's one person in circle 1, 5 people in circle 2, 25 people in circle 3, 125 people in circle 4, etc. And each person is paired with 5 people in the circle surrounding them. So the person in the first circle is paired with all 5 people in circle 2. Each of the 5 people in circle 2 is paired with 5 people in circle 3, etc. Okay, so now, and so there are 100 circles, and the 100th circle is composed of serial killers who would kill people if given the opportunity. And so each person has, and the people in the first 99 rows are perfectly moral people, okay? They act benevolently, okay? So just whatever you think a good person would do, that's what they would do. So the person, so each of the people has 2 options. Option 1 is kill one person, and option 2 is give the 5 people who correspond to you the same options that you were given. So if the person in circle 1 takes option 1, then just one person will be killed, and it's the process there. If he takes option 2, then each of the 5 people corresponding to him, they'll each have they'll each have both of the options. So each of them will be able to kill one person or to pass the buck, so then to the 125, 625, etc. And so the question is, what on a deontological account should they do? Well, so you might think that the answer is obvious. They should just do action 1, because if you think that they should do action 2, then that would result in 5 to the power of 99 people getting killed. And so, however, this runs into a problem, where it runs afoul of a very plausible ethical principle, which says that giving a perfectly moral person extra options cannot bring about a worse state of affairs. So if a perfectly moral person, if we can choose between giving them 1 option or giving them 2 options to choose between, well, then giving them the extra option can't make things worse, because they would only choose the option if it's a better option. And so the deontologist holds that you should kill one person, that if you were deciding whether or not to kill one person, to give 5 other people only the option 1, namely the option to kill one other person. So basically, whether you should kill one person to prevent 5 other people from killing one person. Well, then in that case, they would say that you should do it. That you shouldn't do it. That you should not kill 1 to prevent the 5 murders. Well, if you shouldn't kill 1 to prevent the 5 murders, then you certainly shouldn't kill 1 to prevent 5 perfectly moral people from having 2 options, which include murders, because either they'll pick the murder option, and if they do, then that's the better option. So worst case scenario, it's the same. Or they'll pick the other option only if it's better, and so they'll pick that other option. And so if we accept that principle, then we would have to hold that you should that you should take option 2, because option 2, given that you should take option 2 in a scenario where we stipulate that the extra observers are given fewer options, we should certainly take option 2 if we give them more options. So that's another objection to rights. That argument was a bit confusing. I
you
can
have a
link
blog post on that one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can link I can link my blog post about this. I think that might have been a bit confusing.
The Constitution actually lays this out. They say among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And there are actually many others. And it's very clear in the Constitution of the United States, I'm just using this as an example, that they distinguish between the natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, versus the legal rights that we have. And the problem with utilitarians is they have a really hard time making sense of these natural rights that we have. Now, before I go on to give you a quotation.
We have an easy time making sense of it. You don't have any.
Don't exist.
The set of all your natural rights is the empty set.
Demonstrate just this. I need to say a little bit about duties. Duties are the flip side of rights. If I have a right to life, then you have a duty not to kill me. A lot of times they describe duties are the co-relatives of rights. These are the opposite side of the same coin. If you have a right to something, then that imposes a duty on me. And if I have a right, that imposes a duty on you. And utilitarians, they have a really hard time of making sense of these, because these rights that we have, these human rights, they're inalienable, and they impose absolute restrictions on the way that others might.
Well, okay, let's think a little bit about the idea of a human right. So do animals not have human rights? If so, what's true about humans in virtue of which they have rights? So, like, is it because of our intelligence? Well, then do very unintelligent people not have rights? Is it because of our DNA? Well, then if you edited our DNA, then would we not have rights?
Treat us. And you cannot violate these rights, even if the payoff in the end is really, really, really good. That's the whole point of a right, is that it serves to protect you against.
Well, then you should not kill one person to save the world.
The actions of others, even in the case, and especially in the case where violating that right would produce greater social benefit. And utilitarians actually acknowledge, they say, they're aware that their theory can't protect these basic human rights. And in fact, John Stuart Mill, he was the second guy that we had talked about as one of the founders of utilitarianism. He said just this: all persons are deemed to have a right to equality of treatment, except when some recognized social expediency requires the reverse. Now that's a very highfalutin way of saying something, but basically he's saying this: everybody has a right to equality, except when it benefits society to remove this right. You have a right to equality of treatment, except when it benefits society not to treat you with equality, which is basically just a way of saying this: when it benefits society to treat you equally, then you're going to get treated equally. When it benefits.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously true. There are lots of ways that we could treat everyone equally in ways that would make no sense. So, we could treat everyone equally by making everyone have to pay exactly the same amount of money in taxes by just imposing a head tax rather than like a flat tax or a progressive tax. But we wouldn't think that that's good. We could treat everyone equally by giving children the right to vote, but we wouldn't think that's good.
a society to not treat you equally, then you're not going to get treated equally. But that's not really a right at all. A right is supposed to exist always. It's supposed to protect you. If it's an inalienable human right, it can't be taken away just because it benefits society to mistreat you. And so, like I said, utilitarians are very, very aware that their theory cannot protect basic human rights. And this is the fundamental problem I think that utilitarianism has always faced, because it's so focused on the consequences of our actions that when we can always come up with reasons to mistreat people, to treat them as just objects or tools of manipulation. And that seems wrong. You might hear people say things like this, like there's just some ways you don't treat people. I've heard people say this from time to time when maybe someone gets lied to or someone gets mistreated or treated like just an object or a tool. You'll hear people say, you just don't do this to people. And
I mean, you would hold that for like
stilts.
I think, yeah. The thing is that like as long as you stipulate the consequences are like serious enough for like not doing that, then it just becomes ridiculous to like have like an absolutist stance against that. And if you're not an absolutist about rights, then it actually becomes even more difficult to explain why once you pass a certain threshold of like preventing harm, then you can't violate rights.
Can't.
Once it, and then when you get above that threshold, you're not allowed. You're allowed to, which is it's very odd, like how to justify that. So.
Yeah. No. Yeah, I agree. I mean, the criticism of utilitarianism is that it says rights are not fundamental, but like, we've given a bunch of objections. I don't think that we should think rights are fundamental. I mean, I think that, so like if a person adopts the like absolutist deontologist line where they say like, there's something, you should never violate rights. Well, that just has insane reductive. So like presumably theft is a rights violation. So should you not steal 1 penny from Jeff Bezos to prevent infinite babies from being like doused in motor oil and then set on fire? And so if they say, and if they go the moderate deontologist route, well, one, it goes into all those objections that I had, including the one that moderate deontology actually just collapses to absolutist deontology in certain stipulated cases.
The problem with utilitarianism, they can't ever say that. They can never say, you just don't do this to people, because if the payoff is good, you do it to people. So this is the main problem with utilitarianism, is that utilitarianism fails to protect rights, particularly what we call natural rights. It cannot make sense of these kinds of things.
Wow.
Now, it's hard for me to say a lot.
Okay, well, that was cool. Okay, so now we're going to respond to this guy's video. I debated this guy yesterday. Oh, God, his video, so bad. Like, the arguments are like, just non-existent. It's like hilarious.
Dominated places, or you're even interested in philosophy, you might recognize that it is quite often that people appeal to utilitarianism in order to justify their political or social stances. Especially this phenomenon is common among people who call themselves consequentialists, meaning that they judge an action based on...
Yes, saying you're a utilitarian is especially common if you're a consequentialist. That's funny because utilitarianism is like a type of consequentialism. That's like saying, like, people who say they have arms. This is especially common among people who say that they have some appendages. Was it as... No, I think it was way worse than Rose Wrist. No, I think Rose Wrist is like at least honest and fine. This person yesterday just wouldn't answer a question and was just making the worst arguments imaginable.
Whether animal torture was okay. He refused to answer that question. He's just dodging the whole time.
On its consequences, and particularly they assume that the best action one should ever take is the one that will maximize utility, which ultimately comes down to a subjective psychological satisfaction of a person or a group of people that will come about due to a given action. This sort of thinking is particularly popular amongst the Marxist types, who even justify their own hypocrisy.
Yes,
I don't think.
Peter Singer. Oh no, it was so funny. The guy yesterday claimed that John Stuart Mill was like a leftist. John Stuart Mill is a liberal. That's like one of his major things. Like he was like one of the fathers of liberalism.
I mean, I usually define like leftist as at minimum you're anti-capitalist, but
right, that's how he was defining it. And then his argument for why he was a leftist was because he like thought women should have the right to vote. Well, it's a good thing that utilitarians were right that women should have the right to vote. We're right that homosexuality is permissible, like in the 1800s.
Appealing to consequentialism and utilitarianism. For example, they might say, sure, I might exploit like 10 people working for me and not allow them to unionize or even own the means of production, but if we look at the bigger picture, those actions have little...
Wait, Hey, he's not thinking of Vosh. He's thinking of Nathan Robinson.
And at the end of the day, I'm for water co-ops. Moreover, have you heard of the economies of scale? It's not like I'm Jeff Bezos or something, but this video is not going to be about Marxists and other leftists who are infected with this sort of thinking. Rather, it will be the refutation of the utilitarian philosophy with the best of my abilities. A refutation that will contain 7+1 objections towards it. And before I shall name my series of objections...
Yeah, it's called 7 arguments, and there are 8 arguments.
Towards this philosophy, it is important for one to understand what this philosophy truly means, and as you can guess, just like an ideology that is subjective, it has many versions of it, ranging from rule and act utilitarianism.
Just like an ideology that is subjective. Well, I don't know why one has to be, like, you know, I'm not a subjectivist about morality. Alistair's not a subjectivist about morality. Mill wasn't. Bentham wasn't, I think. Sidgwick certainly wasn't. Singer wasn't. Katerina de Lazari Rodek, she isn't. Like, it seems like, I mean, I don't know. You know, some are, some aren't. It really depends.
To total, sentient, and negative utilitarianism, which all may differ in some little details, but ultimately they all accept one core assumption that I'm going to critique in this video. In particular, the assumption that...
Yeah, so this is a lie. Wait, here, let's go.
Which all may differ in some little details, but ultimately they all accept one core assumption.
Okay, so recognizes the fundamental role of pleasure and pain. No, that this is false. So one of the things he gave was negative utilitarianism. Well, negative utilitarianism doesn't care about pleasure. It just says that avoidance of suffering is what matters morally. Also, there's objective list theory, which says that we should maximize not just pleasure and pain, but objective list fulfillment. So there are things on an objective list. It's also desire-based utilitarianism, which says we should maximize desire fulfillment. Equates the good with the pleasurable and evil with pain. Well, that's only true of hedonistic utilitarianism. Utilitarianism doesn't say that pleasure and pain are capable of quantification. No, I'm a moral realist. We have to try to make our best guesses about what will be conducive to utility, but it's not a precise science. Like, we can know with relatively high certainty that if we hit people with hammers, that will not be conducive to utility. But the analysis that a utilitarian will do, and for example, deciding upon a policy, will be very simple. Not very simple, will be very similar to the analysis that any of us would do when resolving a political question. When thinking about politics, we would look at okay, what are the expected benefits? What are the expected costs? What will this policy do, etc. And then come to ultimate conclusion.
Assumption that I'm going to critique in this video. In particular, the assumption that one should maximize utility, which by itself is a subjective psychological satisfaction, and of course minimize disutility, which is a subjective.
Yeah, this is false.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
there is preference utilitarianism. Or if you hold to a desire satisfaction view of well-being, then you could say that was technically correct, but
well, right. So his view is that what desire do I reject the fact value distinction? Well, no, I agree that they are different things, and I think it's pretty cringe when people like Sam Harris are like, you can get an ought from an is. You can't, but you also can't get a will be from an is just deductively. But that doesn't mean we can't make inferences. I think that there are certain claims about morality that we can deduce through reason about the badness of pain. So much like when reflecting on what, if I look at my wall, much like I can conclude that it's white. If I think about what it's like to be in pain, I can conclude that that's bad, and that's just a necessarily supervenient feature of pain. The same way that when I see my wall, I experience it as being white. But so the claim that he's saying all utilitarians accept is, I think, is a hedonic view of utilitarianism, which says it's about maximizing good mental states, but it's an attitudinal version of hedonic utilitarianism. So whether or not a mental state is pleasurable is whether a person enjoys the mental state, and that's one view, but that's certainly not the only view. And that's not the view that, most utilitarian, I don't know what percentage of utilitarians are hedonic versus preference versus objectivist theorists, but it's almost certainly not the majority view. But also among hedonic utilitarians, I don't know, I think that there could be an experience that's desirable even if a person does not have a positive attitude towards it. So, for example, if a person is committed a heinous crime before coming to Christianity and then thinks that they're guilty and like deserve to suffer, even though they may like want their suffering to be prolonged and appreciate their suffering. I don't think that their suffering makes them better off. I think it's similarly possible to be mistaken about whether or not a mental state leaves you better off.
Objective psychological dissatisfaction.
Sorry, Alistair, was there anything you wanted to say about that?
No, just let's continue.
Then sure, you may say happiness or being instead of what I said, but if you read Mill, Bentham, Popper, and other utilitarian advocates, it really comes down to what I said. And on the surface level, that sounds pretty smart.
Yeah, that's a lie.
And not just smart, but almost scientific, as when one is doing a calculus, according to Jeremy Bentham, one should determine the intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and of course, subsequently, an individual or a collective must act in a way that will maximize the extent of pleasure over pain, as that's what this philosophy is about, especially the hedonistic utilitarianism. And if our world had zero negative consequences...
Well, he says especially. No, that's just what hedonistic utilitarianism is about.
Hedonism is just one theory of well-being. And
right. Now,
yeah.
I mean, it's the one that the most famous utilitarians tend to defend,
Yeah.
and it's also the correct one, so...
Yeah.
What this philosophy is about, especially the hedonistic utilitarianism. And if our world had zero negative consequences from pleasure and was made out of rainbows and we were all gay unicorns operating under Jean-Jacques Rousseau's general will, then maybe it would have been the most dominant philosophy on the land. However, as we live on planet Earth, as one of creatures shaped by the forces of evolution and reason, a natural series of objections arises to such a philosophy. My first objection is actually not mine, but in fact belongs to John Rawls, who apart from that had also other great things to say, such as defending negative eugenics, as was consistent with his original position. But unfortunately, he won't be remembered for that, but that's a story for another day. In our case, John Rawls made an argument that the greatest good for the greatest number on the massive scale will result in inequalities. In other words, there are inequalities in terms of psychological satisfaction or even other measures of utility. People with low quantity of utility will not be satisfied, and in a sense that is similar to capitalism. But you might say, hey, I reject the notion that utility should be maximized in absolute numbers for the collective. I believe that everyone should have around the same amount of utility. I'm for the average distribution of utility. Well, that's also impossible, my friend, as no person would have the same psychological responses to a given phenomenon as the utilitarian calculus.
Wait, okay. This is very silly.
Very odd.
So
you could say, okay, one objection to utilitarianism is that it's not egalitarian in the sense that it sees no intrinsic value in the distribution of welfare being equal. So say you had like one population, like one person who experiences like 10 utils and like two people. If you just compare like two populations, the fact that they're like has an unequal distribution isn't going to be taken into account on the total view, where you just want to maximize total well-being. A lot of people have the intuition that like equality has intrinsic value. So, but he didn't really do a good job like explaining what the objection was supposed to be.
Yeah, and I mean, when I called him out on this in the debate, he like just started like just repeating like truisms about inequality existing rather than like giving an argument. It was pretty weird. But so I mean, I think that the objection that John Rawls says that this guy didn't want to defend in the debate was that utilitarianism would say that a world where you have two people with like 5 utility is better than a world, or sorry, it is worse than a world with one person with 10 utility and one person with 1 utility, because there's more total utility. And so now utilitarian. So one point that's worth right. So utilitarians instrumentally do support redistribution, and actually more so than the average person. Right, utilitarians tend to give like. People who act on utilitarianism give away a lot of their money because we can help others a great deal. But in terms of, so one point that's relevant is like we have the intuition that their equality is good because there's declining marginal utility for other things. So like if one person had all the money and everyone else had no money, well then that would be much worse for utility because your first $10,000 makes you much less well off than, or sorry, much more well off than your 10 quadrillion and for the first $10,000. But in the case of utility does not have declining marginal utility. And so when we think about equal utility, it's really like a life that's truly twice as good. And so our intuitions are not going to be reliable there. But I think there are some very good objections to it, in particular given by humor. So one of them is that if we start from 3 premises, the first one is that if possible world X is better than world Y for every individual who exists in either world, then X is better than Y. That seems obviously true.
Yeah.
Second is that if X has a better average utility, a higher total utility and no more inequality than y, then x is better than y. And 3 is that better than is transitive. If we accept those, then it shows that equality lacks intrinsic value. And so to think about the earlier case, if we have, consider a world of 1 million people with 101 utility. Compare it to 2 million people with 50 utility. World 1 is better if we accept that having a higher average utility, total utility, and more equality than world 2 makes it better than world 1. Which seems, it's on every plausible worldview, having a higher average and total utility, then that's better. So then we can compare world 2 to world 3. World 3 has 1 million people with 102 utility and 1 million people with 1 utility. World 3 is better, given that it's better for every single person. All the 1 million people have higher utility in world 3, and there are an extra million people with overall positive lives. World 3 is better for all individuals who exist in either world, so it's better overall. And then if we accept transitivity, then this means that world 3 is greater than world 1, which is greater than world 2. Thus, 1 million people with 102 utility and 1 million people with 1 utility is overall better than 2 million people with 50 utility. So if we accept these very and I wrote an article on this that I can link. And so if we accept this very plausible principle, this shows that egalitarianism lacks intrinsic value. Another clever argument that came from humor is, so if we have two states of the world that each have two people. So in state of the world 1, so one person has 100 units of utility for their first 50 years of life, and then 50 units of utility for their second 50 units of life. And the second person has 50 units of utility for the first 50 years and 100 units of utility for the next 50 years. So that's the first state of the world. So for the first 100 years, you have one person with 100 utility and one person with 50 utility. Then for the second half, they switch. So then the first guy has 50 utility and then the other guy has 100 utility. And we compare that to a state of the world where two people have 75 utility for all 100 years. Well, so those worlds are clearly equal because in both worlds, all the people have exactly, like you have two, the people all have identical utility. And 50 years of 100 utility and 50 years of 50 utility is an average of 75 years of utility. So your life is just as good if it's half 100 utility and half 50 utility as if it's all 75 utility. So everyone's life is just equal. Okay, so world 1 and world 2 are equally good. And then we say, okay, well, world 1 is just as good as the first half of world 1 plus the second half of world 1. Given that, world 1 is just the first half of world 1 plus the second half of world 1. And so world 1, and the first half is just as good as the second half, which means that the first half, where you have one person with 100 utility and one person with 50 utility, is just as good as half of the value of the world 1 total, which is the same as half value of world 2 total. And so one person with 100 utility and one person with 50 utility is just as good of a state of the world as two people with 75 utility. That argument was also sort of kind of technical. I can post a link.
Humer has a. Yeah, do you want to link Humer's paper on that? Because I found that really convincing when I sat down with that.
If you can find that paper, that would be great. I'm having trouble finding the. Let's see.
Let's just move on to the video for now. We can.
Yeah. I'll send the Humer paper in a second. So just a few other very quick objections to egalitarianism. So egalitarianism would also have to hold that if you do something that makes everyone better off, so if you have people with good lives, and then you do something that boosts the well-off people by 1,000 utility and the poorly off people by 50 utility, that while it may be good overall, that it's partially bad because it increases inequality, and equality is bad. However, it seems like no part of that is bad. Making everyone better off. There's no hidden downside that's just outweighed by the upside of making everyone better off. And
isn't that also like the leveling down objection? So it seems implausible to say that harming someone by making them worse off is gonna overall like make some state of the world better. So if you have like one person like just merely harming someone so they come down to like an equal level with everyone else, like you kind of have to hold that would be a good thing to do, but it seems implausible to say that like just the fact that someone else is worse off makes the world a better place. That seems very odd.
I mean, yeah, so I found and I linked the paper, and I can also link my blog post on the subject. Wait, actually, I can't find my. Yeah, okay. So like another problem is, as Harsanyi pointed out, so from behind the veil of ignorance. So if we were equally likely to be any affected party, then we would do the thing that brings about the most utility. And so this is true basically by definition. So if we're deciding whether or not to have a world with one person with 2 utility and one person with 0 utility versus a world where you have 2 people who each have 1 utility. So if we were going to be a random person in that world, well, then we would not care we would find those 2 states of affairs equal, because 2 utility is just defined as the amount of utility that's sufficiently good for a 1/2 chance of achieving it to be just as good as certainty of 1 utility. So if we're impartial, if we're from behind the veil of ignorance, then we're taking a 50% chance of 2 utility for a 50% chance of 0 utility, which is just as good as certainty of 1 utility. So it's just a mathematical entailment.
It's subjective. Even if
also, sorry, one last point. But his objection to average utilitarianism is terrible. His objection to average utilitarianism is that you can't have 2 people who have exactly the same utility. Well, sure, but because our experiences are so different. But that's not an objection.
That's not
right?
an objection.
It just says that you should maximize the average, not that you'll have people be the same. That's just a cool.
If we lived under communistic utopia, equal outcomes are not possible. If one was to be logically consistent, then one should set free the outliers in order to achieve a preferred result. While if you still wish to maximize total utility and not the average utility, no matter the inequalities, then you might as well produce a shit ton of babies and neurostimulating substances in order to keep them satisfied. My second objection naturally comes from...
Well, but producing a shit ton of babies and drugging them up would not bring about the best outcomes.
That level of subjectivity, or should I even say relativity, as some people get enjoyment from things others do not.
And, like, in terms of whether it's good to bring people with good lives into existence, the answer is obviously yes. And those who try to deny that run into a bunch of enormous philosophical problems that we can talk about maybe, but the video's already pretty long, so maybe
that
we
gets
can skip that.
Very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, the basic gist is if you hold that it's not that there's nothing morally good about bringing into existence a person with a good life, well, then bringing into existence a person with 5 units of utility will be morally indistinguishable from bringing into existence a person with 2 units of utility. But if that's true, then if you were having a child and you could just artificially just reduce their happiness by half, it would be morally neutral to do so. And yet that's obviously false. And there are more complicated things to say, but there isn't time to say them.
Not, which is to say that an implementation of utilitarianism on the massive scale will simply not work. People's interests often go against each other, and not just in the workplace. In case if Marxists are watching me, the interests of other groups are also in conflict, as for example, it is in the psychological...
The Marxists are watching him?
So what's his... This came up in the debate. He said, like, groups have conflicting interests, therefore, like, somehow he wanted to move from that to, like, that being an objection to utilitarianism, which...
Yeah, no, I mean, it was just a nice FYI. Like, it was like, it was just like, groups compete sometimes. But I don't understand what his solution is, right? Like, the fact that groups compete means we need some solution to it. And so, like, utilitarianism gives a solution, which is we take everyone's interests into account and weigh them equally. I don't know, like, I don't understand what the solution is supposed to be. And he wasn't able to give one. He was just, like, he kept just, like, making just, like, statements about the world that were not arguments against utilitarianism.
satisfaction of the police to be left alone and not being attacked, while it is in the psychological interest of the Antifa types or other criminals to get rid of them, no matter what the public opinion or even police thinks of it. People I've read before often bring up sadism and masochism, but I think one can dig deeper than that and say that it doesn't just revolve around individual or sexual matters, and one way we can make this deeper is to bring up Karl Popper's negative utilitarianism, which argues that we should minimize psychological disutility. But as we live in...
Wait, was Karl Popper a negative utilitarian?
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
I'm pretty sure he was.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Okay, yeah.
In a multicultural and pluralistic society, we cannot agree on what to do with certain groups like BLM. My third objection to utilitarianism...
It's not an objection to say people disagree on... Like, I don't even know what the argument is supposed to be. So I'm just confused.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the argument is like interest conflict ... So utilitarian's false.
is that it's not even clear who it applies to, and as a result, it is kind of absurd.
Everyone.
There are literal utilitarianism who wish to apply this principle to criminals, to animals, and even to creatures so simple as ants.
Wait, should we like just not care about the interests of like
Morality doesn't apply to
criminals?
criminals.
Yeah.
So that we take their psychological opinion into the consideration while making a choice, and we better not bring this utility to pigs or chickens or other living creatures for our own benefit, as according...
Yeah, like, is he fine with like torturing animals? Well, he was unwilling to answer the question for upwards of 20 minutes of the debate.
To Jeremy Bentham's dogma, the interest of all should be treated equally, and in a situation where the line of who we consider a member is blurred, it leads to absurdities such as...
Well, wait, no, not all ecosystems in the Earth. And not all species on
Not all
Earth.
animal
We
life
only
either.
care about sentient beings. No, we only care about sentient beings.
when we widely overestimate our duties to animals. My fourth objection to
I
utilitarianism...
mean, the thing is, I think that we should...
Overestimate. You said,
Yeah, I mean,
oh my god.
so dumb. I mean, I think that whether we should care about a being is determined by whether, if we were going to be in their shoes, whether we think that we would matter. So, like, if you were going to turn me slowly into a pig, after I was turned into a pig, I would not want to be factory farmed. But if you were going to like turn me into a plant, after I was a plant, I wouldn't care what happened. And so, you know, if we're just ignoring pigs for no reason, just because they're pigs and because vegans are annoying sometimes, it's so stupid.
Utilitarianism is its lack of intrinsic morality, as they judge an act based off of its psychological utility. So therefore, from the utilitarian perspective, things like keeping promises, if the person you're keeping a promise to is dead, or is not of your own self-interest, if you're an egoistical utilitarian, of course it should not be required, as there is just no value attached to it. What do you get out of it? You can cheat on your husband.
Well, no,
I mean, like, breaking promises, like, most of the time is bad. Like, okay, if you had just like perfect foreknowledge and you knew you could get away with breaking a promise, then you'd be fine. But it's like, I think you brought up in the debate, like drunk driving, right? It's like you're taking a huge risk and the benefits aren't really that much at all. And yeah,
Yeah, no, I agree.
At least in the actual world, like maybe in some imaginary world, then like promise breaking wouldn't be as commonly as wrong, but
yeah, no, I mean, I just linked a blog post. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that promise breaking and having an affair you shouldn't do it because it poses major risks of harm. There are some cases where it won't end up being harmful. It's like drunk driving in that respect. You shouldn't drive while drunk, but there are cases where driving while drunk will end up not being harmful. But you should, you can't know beforehand, so you shouldn't do it in the real world. And you should be the type of person who wouldn't even consider doing it. So yeah, that's the fundamental argument. But like, I don't know. So, you know, to give a beefed up version of his objection. So Humor has given this case where like a guy is on his deathbed and he's like, give all my money to my sons. And he has like $100,000. And so no one else hears him say that. So you can either give the money to his sons or to like a charity. Well, I think you should give it to a charity, right? Like, you know, if you give it to a charity, you can save the lives of 25 people. Wait, sorry, we said $100,000. So the cost to save a life is $4,500. So you can save the life. 100 over 4.5. So that's like a bit over 25. So you can save like So that's like 28 or something, if I did the math correctly. So you can save like the lives of like 28 people. Seems like you should do that. Like, I mean, I don't know. If we think about it from the perspective of the victim, like if you were a random one of the people, it could either be the son, you would like get a bit of money from your dad and like not benefit that much from it, or be to have a 28 and 29 chance of just dying of malaria. You know, impartially, you would obviously choose the money to be given to charity. And no, I mean there was an analogy I gave in this case. So like, okay, imagine a person. Well, yeah, it would take a while to explain, but you should all read the article. The article I think was very good. But, if I do say so myself.
Husband or wife, as long as you don't tell them that, because if you tell them, only then it will bring you and them this utility. Moreover, why just stop at that? You can sure do other sort of stuff we might recognize as immoral, such as cannibalism or blink blink, a similar political structure to that of Israel, whether you consider it moral or immoral.
Yeah, I think this guy is like, I don't know. I'm pretty sure this guy is like alt-right.
Yeah, he brought up race and like really like just out of nowhere in certain cases during debate. That was I mean, kind of like a big red flag.
My views on Israel are just entirely determined by whether I think that Israel doing things is conducive to well-being. Like, I don't have super strong views on it. I think it's a complicated issue, but like
also cannibalism isn't intrinsically wrong.
Right now, I mean, if his view is that you should just never do cannibalism, well, that's obviously absurd. You know, like, okay, let's imagine that if you didn't eat a human, then infinite people would be brutally tortured and killed. Obviously, you should do cannibalism then. I mean, like, I don't understand what like I don't understand what the like special objection is to cannibalism, other than the fact that it's gross.
It's one of those disgust reaction cases. Which it's always amusing.
I mean, this is sort of what we talked about earlier with the studies about how like resistance to utilitarianism is a result of unreliable emotional reaction. Like, it's just sort of like we find X disgusting, and so we judge it morally wrong.
Well, I certainly don't attach morality to it, but I was really surprised that they are justified by the utilitarian philosophy. If people want to live in an ethno-state.
He doesn't attach morality. Yeah, in the debate that I did with him, it was sort of weird. He was talking about like Darwinian morality, but if you know anything about Darwinianism, it's not a moral system; it's a descriptive claim. Okay, so I haven't read this article, but there's like a 90% chance that it's very bad. Here, wait, let's actually pull up the article. The racial, I'm going to bet that the argument is going to be that utilitarianism says we should harm the minority to benefit the majority. And which is false. It only says that if so it's not like just whatever benefits the majority. It says that we should only do it if it is like overall conducive to utility. So it involves.
I think the phrase "the greatest good for the greatest number" actually causes a lot of confusion in people. Like, some people seem to think, oh, if 51% would benefit slightly by like just harming the rest of people in society, then utilitarianism implies that should happen. But
yeah, I can't find the article, but
I mean, it was probably terrible, so we can move on.
Yeah.
And it will bring them psychological benefits such as a stronger trust and more equality. Let them have it, the logic goes. The more you know, huh? Unfortunately, for some strange reason, I have not seen
if the argument is like, if ethno-states were conducive to utility, then utilitarianism would justify it, sure, but they're obviously not. They cause vast amounts of suffering, huge number of people being displaced, mass death. Like, I mean, it's just like, well, I think this guy is pro-ethno-state, but I could be wrong about that, so, I don't know.
Well, maybe because they are some sort of a cringy conservative moral fads who are not rational enough to accept their favorite philosophy to the fullest extent. Perhaps one should introduce them into moral relativism 101, and they might learn a thing or two. My fifth objection to utilitarianism.
Moral relativism 101. Utilitarianism doesn't have to be a relativist view. Like, there are lots of utilitarian moral realists. I don't know, like, it's maybe the majority. It's probably the majority view. I don't really know.
Is a Jordan Peterson style one, and basically as a result of utilitarianism.
Ah, yes, a Jordan Peterson style one. Well, so when we think about the way that well-being is conceptualized, it's like, well, it's wrapped up within the structures of hierarchy. And it's like, that's not a trivial point. And so, you have the postmodern neo-Marxists, let's say, and they think that we can get rid of that we should have utility. It's like, okay, well, how the hell do you propose to do that? And it's like, you can't do it without the Judeo-Christian ethic.
Reliance on moral consequentialism, you are expected to do a lot of shit in order to bring the supposed maximum amount of good to the society. For instance, you will never go beyond your limit, and you will be constantly obliged to fulfill the maximum of your abilities, which can vary from sacrificing oneself for the greater good, or donating most or all of your money to charity. In the real world,
utilitarianism says it would be good if you do donate most of your money to charity. If anything, this is an anti-Jordan Peterson argument, because Jordan Peterson says you should do good things.
I think it is important to, so utilitarianism does imply that what you have most reason to do is to donate substantial portions of your money away to effective organizations. But it doesn't follow from that you should blame people for not doing that, or you should make that as like a benchmark for being a good person, or because obviously doing that itself would not maximize utility anyway. So it's important to separate praise and blame from right and wrong, and that seems to mitigate people's intuitions against the demandingness problem, in my view.
Right. I mean, so there seem to be some instances of doing good things where we would say that doing a thing to help others is actually bad, right? So if I underwent horrific torture to prevent you from spraining your ankle, that wouldn't be good, right? That would leave I would be acting foolishly. From an impartial point of view, what I would be doing would be wrong. You wouldn't call me a bad person, right? Because bad person generally implies not caring about others, but you would say I'm doing something wrong. And so utilitarianism just says that if you were just doing the best possible thing, being the most moral possible person, so being like a Gandhi or a Mother Teresa. Well, Mother Teresa seems like she may have been pretty evil, but that's its whole can of worms. But if you were just doing the most good possible thing, then you would donate the majority of your money to effective charities. But it doesn't say that that's a requirement to be a moral person. And I don't know, it
is what you ideally ought to do, though, which some people would say is a bit counterintuitive. They have to,
I think that when we think about it more, it stops being counterintuitive. Let's just imagine what the most moral possible person would do. Well, it seems like they would, it seems intuitive that they would give away the vast majority of their money. Now, he says that utilitarians would have to hold that the most moral thing would be to live on $1 a day. That's obviously not true. You're going to be less productive and less able to have meaningful relationships, convince others to donate to charity, help others, etc. if you're on the brink of starvation, obviously. But so this allegedly unintuitive result is just if you were doing the best possible thing, what would it be? Well, I don't know. It seems intuitive that the best possible thing, that if you were the best human ever, you would be doing a lot more than most humans should be expected to do. And it also it only seems demanding if we look at it from our own perspectives and not from the perspectives of the victims. But if we look at it from the perspectives of the victim, and it's we're getting a nicer, a fancier car that can drive faster, at the expense of 9 children dying. From the perspective of the children, it would seem very demanding that they have to fucking die of malaria so that we can't, so that we get to have a nicer car. It's only when we only look at it from our own perspective that it seems demanding. I don't know.
Run the trolley problem, but just put an expensive car on one track and 5 people on the other. I mean, it seems like you're required to take the hit. Even if it's an expensive car that you really like. I mean,
yeah, I don't know why we would expect morality not to be demanding. It just, it seems like what a perfectly moral person would be demanding. But yeah.
Acts like that are considered morally worthy and considered as if you went beyond your limit and accomplished something intrinsically morally righteous and even heroic. While under utilitarianism, you basically must do this stuff constantly and you will never reach the ceiling because you can always do better and will never be perfect, but you will constantly feel obliged to satisfy the demand, just as those far left white liberals who feel a strong sense of duty to suck up to every other group besides them and validate them. And perhaps they are the
What is this? What is it with this guy and like weirdly stoking racial animus? It's very strange. But in terms of like utilitarianism says you're just doing your minimum duty if you are like super moral. No, I mean that's not true. Utilitarianism says that you're doing if you give all your income above like $30,000, you're doing something really virtuous that almost no one would do. You know, you may not be living up to what the most moral possible person would do, but you're still doing something really, really good. And way beyond what most people should be expected to do. You're doing something really praiseworthy. I don't understand what the distinction is between utilitarianism and other views there. And then the argument about like we are self-loathing because we're liberals.
Can you rewind that? Like, I want to hear what you actually said again.
Reach the ceiling because you can always do better and will never be perfect, but you will constantly feel obliged to satisfy the demand, just as those far left white liberals who feel a strong sense of duty to suck up to every other group besides them and validate them. And perhaps they are the truest utilitarians, as they are also the most universalist and as a result mentally unstable, which is just
what? Wait.
Liberals are mentally unstable, therefore utilitarianism is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, even if we grant that utilitarians are disproportionately mentally unstable, like very smart people are also disproportionately mentally unstable, but that doesn't mean that being very smart is like bad. Like you can, it's also not reverse causal, and this is also about liberals, not utilitarians. This is just like bizarre.
Another separate point to reject utilitarianism. And since I brought up moral consequentialism and not caring for the means, it is ultimately unjust as a result, as it fails to be intrinsically moral and it being a consequentialist.
Wait, this is like not... I didn't understand what Trotsky is saying here, but this doesn't seem to be very utilitarian. The end may justify the means, as long as there is something that justifies the... Well, maybe that is. I don't know. Hard to say.
Ideology transforms into a state where whatever means that will bring the greatest average amount of utility or the highest total amount of utility can be justified. And whether it is...
Yeah, I mean, average utilitarianism is nuts. So it would say that if there were... That if you had a billion people with 10 quadrillion units of utility, and then a billion people with 10 billion units of utility, you should just kill all the people with 10 billion units of utility to raise the average utility.
Is the collectivization of the Soviet Union, stealing stuff if you really need it, or not punishing a murderous scientist who may help to produce a better vaccine for COVID-19, as long as the end result will bring...
What? COVID vaccines are good.
Was that actually like... Was that actually a dog whistle against vaccines, or is he just...
I think so. Let's...
Consequentialist ideology transforms into a state where whatever means that will bring the greatest average amount of utility or the highest total amount of utility can be justified. And whether it is the collectivization of the Soviet Union, stealing stuff if you really need it, or not punishing a murderous scientist who may help to produce a better vaccine for COVID-19, as long as the end result will bring...
Wait, okay, so if not punishing bad people would bring about more utility, then we shouldn't do it. Agreed.
Utility to the people means like that.
I mean, like, I don't understand what the justification is for punishing people, like, aside from utility that it brings.
Should suffice. But you might object and say, hey, wait a minute, you have rule utilitarianism, which argues that a specific action is more...
Hey, wait a minute, you have rule utilitarianism, which argues that a specific action...
...probably justified if it conforms to a justified moral rule, and you may have a point, but it's not really that utilitarian, as it is in conflict with act utilitarianism, and it is more in line with Kant's categorical imperative, which is counter...
What?
No, it's not really.
Wait, he says that... Wait, okay. This is hilarious. So one, the thing he put up on screen was the collapses to act utilitarianism objection, where the objection is that rule utilitarianism ends up being the same as act utilitarianism. Second, rule utilitarianism is not deontological. It is... It doesn't think that the motive is what matters. It doesn't think that there's a categorical imperative.
utilitarian.
Yeah.
So if you really believe in that, you might as well just reject utilitarianism as a whole, as a utilitarian cannot be telling the truth if lying maximizes utility. Finally, there is the issue with the predictive power of consequentialism, as it varies depending on
Predictive power? Does he think that it's like a scientific theory? Is he like copying from P-Jump's epistemology, where he's like, that's a novel testable prediction?
the action. The predictive power of an end utility that may range from negative, that is this utility, to a maximum utility, that is 1. For instance, the utilitarian consequences of raising the minimum wage in the US to $15 an hour are hard to quantify and in some cases would even bring this utility. Even though I am sympathetic to such a proposal, it is hard to predict exactly what will happen as a result. My seventh...
Wait, so... Yeah, it's sometimes hard to figure out whether things are conducive to utilitarianism.
Yeah, I don't know why that's an objection.
Yeah, I mean, like, presumably if the minimum wage was bad for utility, it would be bad. If it were good for utility, it would be good. And we're not. And so when figuring that out, we would like look at the empirical data around it and then come to conclusions.
Objection to utilitarianism precisely deals with the matter of utility and psychological satisfaction, and they...
I mean, like, how does he decide whether or not a $15 minimum wage is good if he doesn't look at the consequences? Because looking at the consequences would be too difficult.
Both are at conflict with each other, to the surprise of the early utilitarians. The thing about it is that abusing drugs, porn, alcohol, or any other type of activity or a substance that...
Wait, why did this pop up when he was talking about abusing drugs, porn, and alcohol?
May give you short-term pleasure will ultimately give you long-term consequences that are not going to be of a great utility if we define utility as one's fitness, which is not just physical, but rather all-encompassing concept.
Wait, go back.
Oh my god.
Make sure that the fitness thing's on screen, because...
Great utility if we define utility as one's fitness, which is not just...
Yeah, but you can't just say, oh, I'm going to... Utilitarians define fitness in terms of, like, they equate utility with fitness when they explicitly do not do that. Like, so
yeah,
why?
No, I mean,
what is
fitness,
this?
like, fitness relates to being able to pass on one's genes.
Good genes.
It's like not normatively laden. Like, if a person was very fit reproductively by like raping a bunch of people, they would be fit reproductively. But that wouldn't be morally praiseworthy. You know, we have to look at it from along the lines of the lobster. But and also his argument about like doing drugs and cocaine, those, well, the cocaine is a drug, about like, yeah, becoming like abusing drugs, those may result in short-term happiness, but not long-term happiness. Utilitarianism is about overall happiness. So
yeah,
on utilitarianism, it's good overall. I mean, this is just
like,
this is only an objection to utilitarianism if it only cares about the short term.
Yeah, that's stupid.
Yes.
Physical, but rather all-encompassing concept. Substance addiction and a disruption of one's dopamine responses or any other change of character are proven to be evolutionary not beneficial and of a bad fitness. Consider the experience machine that virtual reality, video games, and certain narcotics are trying to implement. Do you think it is a great idea for all of us to live in an episode of the Black Mirror, where we live just for the hedonistic pleasure and with no real concern for our fitness, which often comes at the expense of pleasure? And that's my
Wait, what if
point.
we were
Utilitarianism also...
Wait, okay, what if we like were just ejaculating constantly and like having tons of babies while in the experience machine? Then would we be in favor of it? I mean, like, you can't have a morality that's just like whatever increases our survival abilities is morally good. Then, like, well, if that's true, then
ultimately fails at the most important part of the equation, and that is...
And like, bacteria are morally the best of us because they have the most offspring. Like, rape is fine if it increases survival.
I mean, do you want to talk about the experience machine, or do you want to move on? Because that's a decent objection to hedonism, but it's not like he gave it in like the strongest terms.
Yeah, we can talk about the experience machine. I read a blog post about that talked about the experience machine that I'll find. If you have any thoughts,
I mean, my main objection to the experience machine would just be, well, first of all, I think a lot of people's reactions against it are due to irrational fear and sometimes even revulsion, because I think what most people imagine is something like, you know, the Matrix, where you got like electrodes like stuck into your brain, and it's like all like icky and disgusting. So I think that can partly explain why people have like a resistance to say they'd be better off in the experience machine. And
Yeah,
I also
very
think
good.
status quo bias probably has a lot to do with it as well. Even if you stipulate, like they've done studies where they ask the participants, like, okay, just assume for the sake of argument you were in the experience machine right now, and if you unplugged, you'd actually live like a better life than you are now, even though now you're in the experience machine. Even then, people say that they would rather stay in their life right now rather than unplug, which kind of suggests that people are just going off. They like the way the things are, and it's scary for them to consider changing it. So,
Right. Yeah, I mean, so a few other points, I think. So one of them is that I think that on all plausible views, happiness experienced in the experience machine is at least somewhat good. If you held that it's not morally good, then it would be morally neutral to just press a button that would have the happiness in the experience machine, which seems very counterintuitive. Second, if we conceive of like a like reverse experience machine, the intuition seems to go away. So if you were like plugged into the experience machine to just be have the experience of being tortured while not actually being tortured, then it doesn't seem like that's true. It also seems like if a person voluntarily plugged into the experience machine, then they would not be making any mistake, right? Like, you know, maybe you don't want to, but if a person did want to and it made their life better, like the intuition generally isn't that they would be making a mistake. And so it seems like it just relates to whether it seems to us like it would be worth plugging in. In terms of what you said about status quo bias, so actually, so Singer talked about this in his book. He said, quote, Felipe de Brigard decided to test whether the status quo bias does make a difference to our willingness to enter the experience machine. He asked people to imagine that they are already connected to the experience machine and now face the choice of remaining connected or going back to live in reality. Participants in the experiment were randomly offered one of three different vignettes. In the neutral vignette, you're simply told that you can go back to reality, but given no information about what reality will be like for you. In the negative vignette, you are told that in reality, you're a prisoner in a maximum security prison. And in the positive vignette, you're told that in reality, you are a multimillionaire artist living in Monaco. Of participants in the neutral vignette, almost half said that they would prefer to stay plugged in. Among those given the negative vignette, that figure rose to 87%. Most remarkably, of those given the positive vignette, exactly half prefer to stay connected to the machine rather than return to reality as a multi-millionaire artist living in Monaco. And so our intuitions about the experience machine are just like, you know, completely wild and don't seem to hold up to scrutiny. And there's a plausible evolutionary debunking account of why we would prefer real pleasures and real pleasures that increase our fitness over just sort of fake things. But every time a person plays a video game, they're sort of entering the experience machine, and yet that doesn't seem to be objectionable.
Is precisely the self. The overexposure of oneself to pleasure will inevitably lead to erosion of good character and an increase of environmental mutational load into the population if this philosophy was to be followed by many people, and therefore it would implement a failure of both at the individual and the collective level. Unfortunately, living in the contemporary West, where people value strong individualism and whatever bring one a sense of pleasure, and the do-you approach to life, which quite ironically is at conflict with utilitarianism on the collective scale, I have to make arguments against such a philosophy that is contradictory and fails at its core. First, at the assumption that one should value subjective psychology.
Contradictory.
Wait, contradictory. What contradiction does he think he's demonstrated?
Satisfaction, and as a result, quite often be blind to factors that may be psychologically unsatisfying to learn about. And second, it fails at the
What?
consequentialist part, as it has little predictive power and many variations of predictions and subjective understandings of what really will bring the most amount of
Predictive power? What the hell is he talking about? I mean, well, so, you know, if we want to, I don't understand what it means for an ethical theory to have predictive power, though if it means, so, like, in some sense, I think utilitarianism does have predictive power, because utilitarianism gives a series of verdicts about what states of affairs are good. And so it says, like, the repugnant conclusion is good. Sacrificing everything to the utility monster is good. And so that makes implicitly the prediction that if we reflect about those cases, we'll come to the conclusion that those things are good. And I think that when we do come to the conclusion that those things are good, even when it conflicts with our intuitions. And if we look back throughout history at the moral claims that have been made by the early utilitarians, they were very progressive and ahead of their time. Bentham supported homosexuality in 1798, Mill supported giving women the right to vote, etc.
Utility often puts everything at conflict. Perhaps if this philosophy did not produce so much bewilderment and was just hedonistic, I would have a hard time arguing against it. But considering that hedonism is not really beneficial both in the long run and in the evolutionary sense, I would still make the case against it, and even more, challenge its dogma.
Evolution is not normative.
That the most important value we should strive for is subjective psychological utility, and that we all have it equally. And if the common understanding of utility maximizes something in our contemporary society, it sure maximizes mutational load. And on that based note, I end this video encouraging you to share it with other people so that they know why utilitarianism is good.
Wow. Do we wanna see this video?
Yeah, I probably can go for like another 20 minutes or so. That's fine. Maybe
okay.
He realized that utilitarianism was based on a principle that doesn't care about who gets what consequences.
One, I mean, I think we already sort of addressed the sheriff counter.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Let's see. Should we end the stream here, or do we want to go over some other objections to utilitarianism? Maybe.
I mean, is there any objections you think? Do you think we should run through the surface level objections that philosophers don't give, which are very common, among lay people, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so one misunderstanding I constantly see is utilitarians should be constantly making utility calculations 24/7. Even right now, as I'm speaking, I need to be consciously thinking whether I'm maximizing utility, right? Okay, I think what this does, it confuses two slightly different things. So there's a criteria of right action. So, whatever action produces best consequences, impartially considered. And then there's a decision procedure you go through to try and align yourself with that criteria of right action. And those are not the same thing. So if you just say to someone, maximize utility, are you able to act morally just by me telling you to do that? No, because it's just a criteria of right action. It doesn't tell you how to align yourself with that. So that's a common one I see, which is pretty cringe.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, utilitarianism says we should aim our actions at maximizing utility. If whenever we encountered a decision, we did math, try to come to our best guess about whether it would be conducive to utility. Well, that would not be a good thing that a utilitarian could do, because there's a cost to calculating before we make any utterance. So that's a terrible objection, and no serious person makes it. Another objection that people make often is, and this is made by more serious people sometimes, but it's pretty bad, is that we can't calculate utility, so we can't do it. So, I mean, this is true to some. It is difficult to calculate utility, but we can still come to sort of our best guess about things. And so if we know, it seems like poverty decreases people's happiness. So when evaluating a policy, we'll look at, okay, do you think this will increase poverty or not? And we constantly make utility comparisons in our own lives. So when deciding what to do on a Saturday, we'll decide what thing we think will be the most fun. We making comparisons of how much joy we think different actions will bring about is just an inevitable part of life. So that objection, I think, is very bad. Another like brain dead objection to utilitarianism. I hear this one a lot. People will say that utilitarianism justifies slavery. It obviously does not. Slavery was not conducive to well-being. It caused like just immense amounts of suffering for much less well-being. Hence, it was not utilitarian.
I mean, being charitable to that objection, you could say, okay, stipulate some counterfactual scenario, then it would justify slavery, but not in the actual world, and that world would have to be so different from ours that it seems like our intuitions would just change anyway. So
right, I mean, if we stipulate that like a demon would destroy the world if we didn't enslave like 1,000 random people, well, it would seem like we should enslave 1,000 random people. And you might say we shouldn't because of rights considerations, but I think that we've already debunked the notion of rights. Rights are nonsense. They've been destroyed. Can't come back from this. They're on their last breath. Let's see. What are others? Oh, well, one that people will give often is like utilitarianism justifies wait, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Like utilitarianism like only cares about trivial pleasures and thinks that we should be just sort of like go around like having orgies and just doing things for like short-term pleasures. But that's obviously false. I think your life will be happier in the long run if you don't just go around like like only doing orgies all day. Doing drugs is obviously not conducive to utility in the long run.
but being an alcoholic does. Like, no, that was fun.
Yeah, apparently. I mean, one objection. This one is slightly higher level, but it's the omelis objection. Are you familiar with like the ones who walk away from omelis?
No.
So it's a story by Ursula Le Guin, I think. And so the premise is like you have this like utopian society, but for it to work, there has to be this one child who's like brutally tortured. And the short story, like it glosses over the benefits of utopia, but just goes into like intense detail about just how terrible things are for the child. And so I think that that's another case where like, well, one, our society is much worse than that society, right? There are lots of people who are just as badly off as that child who are just being brutally tortured in basements somewhere. And yet we think that the world is better as a result of our society existing. And so this world is like way, way better than our society. And it also like the general objections to rights apply here. Like it just seems obvious that that's a better state of the world. We would choose it from behind the veil of ignorance, etc. I don't have any others that I can think of that I particularly want to go over.
Me neither. Unless
Oh, well, no, we can respond to the Jordan Peterson one of, well, so when we think of well-being, it's like, well, what does that mean? And it's necessarily wrapped up within a narrative archetype. It's like, okay, so you have the narrative archetype. Well, what do you do with the narrative archetype? Well, it has to be embedded within a Judeo-Christian structure in order for the narrative archetype relating to well-being to work. The foundational tenet of the hierarchy that is the precondition for well-being to exist at all relates on Judeo-Christian structures. And so for Sam to think that we can just ignore this foundational tenet, well, that strikes me as a very big mistake. All right. Thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks, Alistair.
Yeah.
Part 2 coming soon, probably. Maybe. We'll see.
Maybe.